Today's lecture is entitled Politics as Therapy. I entitled the lecture Politics as Therapy because the ancient Greeks in general, and Aristotle in particular, thought that politics fulfilled two therapeutic roles for individual citizens. On the one hand, the practice of politics was seen as therapeutic, that is to say, it's good for you to engage in a certain kind of political activity. And second, they thought that the role of the government was in some ways akin to the role of the therapist. That is to say, the government was supposed to take care of your soul. Now I want to apologize in advance if this lecture is a little bit long. This lecture is modeled off of my in-class lecture, which goes up to 50 minutes. I don't think this lecture will be 50 minutes long, but there's a lot to talk about in Aristotle. Let me ask you this. Why do we start political philosophy classes typically with the Greeks? Well, I think the ancient Greeks introduced some innovations in political thinking that weren't around, or at least we have no record of, before them. They conceived of the political in ways that are similar to the way we conceive of the political. They thought the political activity was participatory. So prior to the Greeks, the governments we know about are typically despotic and tyrannical, almost certainly monarchical. So the Greeks introduced, they probably weren't the first, but they were the first that we have record of, to introduce participation in politics as part of political activity. They also had a care for liberty, not necessarily the individual liberty that we understand, but liberty as freedom from interference, particularly on the part of citizens who are participatory. So, for example, each individual was free to speak and participate in the polity, in the polis, which is the Greek city-state. Didn't always mean that they had a whole lot of individual rights, however, as we understand. And finally, the Greeks were advocates for self-government. They thought that a people of a city-state ought to be able, within limits, to govern themselves. So again, the Greeks are in many ways innovators, and in many ways our intellectual ancestors. However, there are some big differences between ourselves and the Greeks. Not least because the Greeks were not liberals, and by that I mean they really didn't believe in individual liberty in the way that we do. They thought that there was a very thick relationship between what makes life good and the purpose of government. Today, when we look at the roles of our governments, the role of the government largely is to enable us to pursue happiness, whatever it is. This is in fact in our Declaration of Independence. However, for the Greeks, the idea wasn't to do whatever you like and have the government help you more or less go on your way. The idea was to direct you towards a particular way of life, one that was, dare I say, objectively good. So the point of government was not to protect private rights and enforce individual rights the way American government is often looked at. So if that wasn't the point, then what wasn't the point? Well, as I said, the point was to promote justice, promote a harmony between the individual and the community, and ultimately promote eudaimonia, or the good life. And I'm going to unpack each of these terms one at a time. First, let's talk about justice. For the Greeks, justice is not a set of social relations or a quality that applies to rules or even societies as a whole. For the ancient Greeks, justice is a quality of the individual. In fact, it's a skill. It's a way of living. It's the skill that helps you balance different virtues or different sources of value in your life. When we say justice is giving people their due, that was exactly what the Greeks meant by a just man. The just man was the person who knew how to give every person and every one and everything its due. Every god as well, for that matter. Justice is, therefore, a very important skill, one that enables you to live well in society with others. And like any skill, it's something that you practice to make you perfect at. Now, harmony is this balance between the individual interests and group interests. The just man is going to be the building block on which a harmonious city, a polis, is built. So if justice is a skill, harmony is one of the group goods this skill produces. And finally, this idea of eudaimonia. Eudaimonia loosely translates as happiness, or the good life. But it's worth noting that what the ancient Greeks meant by eudaimonia is not what we mean by happiness. We tend to think of happiness as having our desires satisfied, or having our preferences met in some way. For Aristotle, eudaimonia is the final good at which people and societies aim at, the final good that we seek for its own sake. And eudaimonia, at the end of the day, for Aristotle, was a particular kind of good life. It was living well. Now, in particular, living well as a good human being. Aristotle and Plato spent a lot of time thinking about what is a good human being. We understand what different roles are, what the good sea captain is. We understand what the good farmer is, the good doctor. But what makes a good human being? For them, the idea of a good human being was what are the attributes, character dispositions of a human being that makes them ultimately live well, not necessarily be subjectively happy. Aristotle and Plato were aware that people with poor moral qualities and antisocial people could feel good about those things. They could be perverse in those sorts of ways. So they thought that happiness or a good life was something a little bit different than just the way Jeremy Bentham would look at pleasure and pain. Happiness is an activity. Happiness is something you practice. It's not a state of being or a feeling. And that's sometimes difficult for people to understand in the 21st century, because that's not at all the way most Americans think about happiness. That being said, that doesn't make Aristotle wrong, and indeed we should we should think about the way others look at happiness and see whether, in fact, that might not be a better way of life. I'm not saying that it is, but it's something that's worth a thought. So how do you achieve eudaimonia? How do you get to the good life? Well, for Aristotle, the virtues are the character dispositions that enable people to achieve eudaimonia within their community. If you cultivate the virtues, you will learn to be happy. You will learn what it takes to live a good life. And at the end of your life, you will have a life you will be both satisfied, proud, and fulfilled. Here are some important virtues for Aristotle. These include prudence, justice, temperance, courage, magnificence, magnanimity, liberality, gentleness, wisdom. The list goes on. But the idea is that if you cultivate these character traits, you will live well in society with others. But virtue is so boring, right? Why associate virtue with happiness? Virtue sounds like the opposite of fun, right? The opposite of subjective desire for fun. When I think about what I want to do, it's not practicing charity and self-restraint and courage and moderation. All of these things require that I discipline myself. All of these things require that I exercise efforts of will, and therefore they don't seem like all that much fun. But it's worth noting what happens when we don't practice self-restraint, when we don't live in harmony with our community, when we are immoderate or weak-willed. That doesn't necessarily make us better off. It makes us better off in the short term, but there are long-term costs, and in some cases there's social costs that are associated with failing to exercise self-restraint, by being seen as untrustworthy and being disrespected by one's community. So, for the ancient Greeks, and Aristotle in particular, achieving happiness requires achieving a balance between the individual and the community. And achieving this balance, or you achieve this balance by cultivating the virtues, by cultivating the character dispositions that enable you to live well with others. So what's the government's role in all of this? Well, the government's job was in some ways to produce eudaimonia for its citizens. And to do this, the government had to take an active role in the formation of individual character in its citizens. In particular, the government had to teach people to curb and restrain their appetites for sex, their appetites for power, and their appetites for glory, all of which could be disruptive to social harmony if carried out to excess. If the people were not virtuous, the Greeks thought that the city's politics would reflect this dysfunction and perpetuate dysfunction. So as I said earlier, politics was supposed to be therapeutic. Government was supposed to help us put our souls in order. Government is therefore partly a parent and partly a therapist for it. Indeed, the way Aristotle and Plato saw government was as a kind of feedback loop. And the feedback loop functions as follows. Justice would produce good government, which would produce harmony for all, and that would produce future just citizens. And then just government would produce just citizens, which would in turn reproduce just government. So the idea is you have a big circle here, where just citizens make the government good, and the good government produces just citizens. If you get in this positive feedback loop, everything goes well. But the government has to have a care for the justice of the citizens, that is to say, for the character of the citizens, for their skill at balancing the virtues. If the government takes no care in these things, then citizens will become vicious, and vicious citizens will make very bad government officials, and those government officials will continue to make people vicious. In other words, that would be a negative feedback loop. What this means is that both Plato and Aristotle were skeptical about democracy. Now, Athens at the time was democratic, but Plato and Aristotle were very critical of democracy, or at least pure democracy. Here's what they said. They said, look, democracy means rule by direct majority for them. That is to say, every individual in the polis would vote. And democracy doesn't have any other individual rights other than participatory rights, like I said. The problem for Plato and Aristotle was that they did not trust the people to control their appetites. The people, in other words, are usually unjust. Most people did not receive a good education in the virtues. Most people today probably don't receive a great education, but at the time, even fewer people were well educated, and so people were generally unjust. Their passions are therefore easy to manipulate, and they're particularly prone to excess and envy. Both Plato and Aristotle ultimately would have preferred a more mixed kind of government. They thought that the ordinary citizens should participate in government, but that doesn't mean that they should have final authority. Right? Aristocracy, which is the rule of the excellent, and monarchy could serve to temper the will of the people. This was a fairly progressive view in its own time. Obviously, by today's standards, it's pretty conservative. So, we can ask whether we agree with Aristotle and Plato. Are the people's passions easy to manipulate? Is our democracy ultimately devolving into demagoguery, right, where slick-talking politicians get the people to support positions that are ultimately neither in their interest nor in the general common interest? Certainly those who take Aristotle and classical thought seriously see a big problem with today's liberal societies. What's the problem? Well, the problem they see is that there's no care for the virtues. Government lets you do whatever you want, which has some virtues, but at the end of the day is too permissive. It lets people's passions get the better of them. It ultimately lets people be tyrannized, not from the outside. You're protected from outside tyranny, but you're not protected from inner tyranny, the tyranny of your emotions, of your passions, of your envy, your greed, your lust for money and power. All of those things are not kept in check. And as a result, our politics become dysfunctional. We get into a negative feedback loop where vicious individuals elect vicious politicians who put policies in place that don't have no care for the virtue, and we get more vicious citizens, and so on and so forth. So what do these contemporary, what we call civic republicans and communitarians say? What do they advocate? They say that we need better civic education. Individuals need to be educated about their politics and about the values that animate a republic and that make a republic work. School curricula should be centralized. Civil society institutions like churches and other groups that support virtue ought to be supported. More opportunities should be given to reflect on and make difficult choices. This is a view that stems from Aristotle's idea that in order to be virtuous, you have to practice virtue. And if other people are making choices for you all the time, and you never get the chance to make difficult choices, you are never going to learn. But what about freedom in all of this? Aristotle sounds hopelessly paternalistic to our ears today, and there might be a grain of truth to that. But Aristotle was a big fan of individual autonomy. That is to say, the idea that, well, he was a big fan of autonomy. Whether it was individual autonomy is actually up in the air. But he was a fan of people being able to make laws for themselves, living under rules that they themselves make. But there's several things to bear in mind. In order to be autonomous, in order to make a rule for yourself, it has to be really you, the essence of you making the law. Not your appetites, not your whims, not your desires, but you, all things considered. Which means that it's at least possible that when you are talking, it is not really you that is talking. It is some part of you that has taken over. Like when you are, say, drunk, or when you are in a flight of rage. All of those, Aristotle has said, is not really you. That is to say, the essence of yourself has been taken over by a tyrannical inside passion. And that tyrannical passion is really what's acting here. So from that point of view, autonomous citizens don't just happen, they're created, right? People have to practice keeping themselves in check. And so the need for government and the need for autonomy stem from the same problems, is that individuals are subject to internal vices that make them unhappy at the end of the day. What happens when you get too angry, or when you get too jealous, or when you fall to any other kinds of internal passions? Well, what happens is that, yeah, you satisfy what you want immediately at the cost of long-term objectives. And for Aristotle, the key to being free is not to just do whatever you want whenever you feel like it, but to be the sort of person that lets their true self express themselves. So freedom is very important, but it's not the right to be free from external influence only. All right, I realize that was a bit long, about 17 and a half minutes now. So I'm going to leave it there, and if you have any questions, you know where to find me.